Hello history fans and welcome back to the podcast that helps you learn a little bit of history. It's Women's History Month, so each week I'll be doing a roundup of the week's worth of women I've been talking about. This one will be quite short though, as the 1st of March was on Friday, so we've only got 3 women. For those of you listening, I'll play the short video I've been posting on Instagram and TikTok, and then we'll expand. So if you are listening, don't forget to follow the podcast. If you're watching, please do subscribe and leave a comment letting me know one of your favourite women from history. Shall we get into some history now? It's day 1 of 31 days of women's history for Women's History Month, and we are of course starting with my favourite Celtic queen, Boudica. If you've been around here for a while, you know I've done lots of videos on her and even a full podcast episode on her in the past. It's likely that she witnessed the invasion of Britain by the Romans in the year 43 because she pops up in our history books in the years 60 or 61. There's no knowledge of her previously, and at this point she's married to King Prasutagus, who is king of the Celtic Iceni tribe. When her husband dies, the Romans take all of her power, all of her possessions. They ruin her and her daughter's lives, so she rallies her people behind her to fight back. The Celts' wild fighting style took the Romans by surprise, and for a while it seemed like they were going to win. They destroyed Colchester, London and St Albans, the 3 biggest Roman towns, and they even wiped out the 9th Legion of the Roman army. But it all came down to the Battle of Watling Street, where she met her demise. After the battle, it's not really known what became of her. It's thought, or it's told to us, that she poisoned herself. And we'll never really know for sure because the Celts didn't write anything down, and the Romans had to create her character in a way that justified them losing so many people to her. I mean, she wiped out a legion of the army. Come on. They had to give her some sort of wimpy death because poisoning was seen as the women's way of murder and death, but also she was just so terrified the Romans were going to kill her that she had to do it before they got to her. There's new research that suggests she died near where Verulamium was the ancient name for St Albans. She died near where the museum is today, and on International Women's Day they are opening a brand new exhibition all about ancient women of Verulamium and the women who excavated it in the 1930s, and it opens on Friday, and I'm really excited to go, so you should definitely check out their website. Boudica has become such a complex character in our history, and I've really enjoyed reading and researching about her and where this narrative of her story comes from. And some of my favourite things about her are actually sort of more like historiography. For example, for a while we referred to her as Boudica, but that's just because Tacitus, the Roman historian, misread a previous Latin translation as Boudica when really it said Boudica. And then they also did analysis on like how Celtic spelled the name, and that's why we now have 1 C as well. And she was probably actually a blonde, not the crazy redhead we know today, because now Cassius Dio does give us a very barbaric description of her, but he also uses the word xanthatatus. It's spelt like this, I don't know if I said it right, but he uses that word to describe her hair, and that word in other texts is used to describe the sun or lions. So in my head, that's more yellow than orange, but make of that what you will. So, Boudica. I actually feel like I covered quite a lot in that short video. You got a very solid brief overview, I think. She enters history in the year 60 or 61, and guesses are that she may have been a druid or a priestess before being married to Prasutagus. It's likely she witnessed the Roman invasion of Britain, the invasion of Britain by the Romans in the year 43, as I just think that timeline makes sense. The Iceni tribe that she rules are surrounded by other tribes that work with the Romans, so they're sort of sticking out. So when Prasutagus dies, and the Romans seize all his power, property, and her dignity, it kind of makes sense. Even though Tacitus tells us that Prasutagus left half of everything to Boudica and half to the Emperor Nero, they're the Romans, of course they're going to come in, take over, take everything. Another interesting thing about her name, in the ancient Celtic language, it would have been pronounced in a way that it meant victory. So maybe it's a stage name that was given to her after, or maybe she was always destined to lead an uprising. Not that she was victorious, unfortunately. It's also not unusual that when the rebellion started, the Romans weren't actually phased that much. They'd already taken over so many other Celtic tribes, and in ancient Britain, women could actually hold positions of power, whereas in Rome, they shouldn't really. So they were probably just like, ugh, it's just a woman. What's she going to do? Nothing's going to happen. We're fine. Her people rallied around her, believing that she held the power from God, which came to her because she was queen. And even though she had no training, she did have a military mind when planning attacks. She's quite good. First, the Celts go for Colchester, which was the biggest Roman settlement, Camulodunum. The Roman consul just sends 20 unarmed troops to fend them off in the brand new temple to the Emperor Claudius. There's a 2-day siege until it's taken and burnt to the ground. The other Celtic tribes then realise that they'll maybe stop feuding between each other for a minute because there's a common enemy, the Romans, so they all rally around Boudica too. Well, a lot of them do. The Roman governor for Britain and the army at the time are in Anglesey killing the Druids when this all starts happening, and they realise we should probably go and get them. Boudica has then burnt down London, Londinium, and Verulamium, or St Albans, is on fire by the time the army get there. So Paulinus, the governor, draws Boudica to Watling Street, which is where the final battle happens. And we ultimately know who wins, but if you want all the details and interesting facts more about like her hair, her jewellery, her name, or the fighting style and the battle that happened, please do just scroll back a little bit and listen to the first episode of this podcast. I did a full episode on Boudica. Because there are some nuances as well. In history we see her as this symbol of power, standing up for what you believe in, nearly defeating the Romans, but she was actually quite cruel at times. And with every character from history, you must remember the whole story. You might love Alexander the Great because of all his achievements, but what did he actually do to get there? And it's similar with Boudica. Boudica is a feisty feminist icon now, but in reality she's a barbaric warrior out for vengeance. And both of those titles are why I think she's great. Should we move on? I think so. It's day 2 of 31 days of Women's History for Women's History Month, and today we are talking about one of Chloe's favourite women from history, Sappho of Lesbos.
Hello! So Sappho is one of my favourite historical women purely because she's one of the only women from so far back that we actually know anything about through their own words.
She lived from 610 to 570 BCE, right?
Yes, exactly. A time in which it was extremely rare for women to even receive the kind of education that would allow them to read and write, let alone become extremely celebrated poets.
Very little of her poetry survives today, with most of it being discovered relatively recently. Some of it was discovered shredded up in the wrappings of Egyptian mummies, or stuffed inside mummified crocodiles.
This is a copy of all of her collected works that survive until today. Yeah. That's it. And this text also has a really lengthy introduction and a notes section at the end, which weren't written by Sappho, obviously. So this bit here in the middle is actually what survives of her work. And even then, each of these pieces of poetry have a massive analysis on one side, and then this fragment here is all we have left of Sappho. But all the same, texts written by ancient Greek women are extremely few and far between, so I will take what I can get.
From Sappho, we get both of the words sapphic and lesbian.
Much of Sappho's poetry has themes of homoeroticism between women, and it's one of the earliest historical sources, if not the earliest historical sources, to do so, and certainly the most famous. Hence why we get the words sapphic and lesbian from her name and the island on which she lived, Lesbos.
So moving on to day 2, and Sappho, a video I did with Chloe, known on Instagram as More Tiger Lily Than Wendy. She's a wonderful historian, go check her out. Sappho is an ancient Greek poet living between 640 and 570 BCE. Her sexuality has been debated forever, as she wrote so passionately about women and her desire for them, whilst also apparently throwing herself off a cliff over a man. Some say that she was just trying to get away from him though. And in a world where women not having an interest in men who are so completely obsessed is, especially in history, so unfathomable, you make your mind up on the cliff story. We don't really know anything about her. Her family is thought would have been aristocrats. What she looked like is always changed in descriptions. But we do know that she lived in Mytilene, the capital of Lesbos, a Greek island associated with women who were just friends. And she wrote poems. What's most impressive, I think, is that she was celebrated in her day, and equal to Homer, described as the poetess to his The Poet, enjoyed by Plato, who dubbed her the 10th muse, and apparently even Aristotle liked her work. And she's written about by Alexandrian scholars. Her compiled works took 9 papyrus scrolls, or 10,000 lines of lyric poetry. That's quite a lot. It's tragic that so much of her work was lost to floods, fires, and other issues. But we have so much from male writers. Such a shame. Her work contains a lot of passion and emotions, with just some allusions to the politics of the time. She commonly writes about her Thiassos, the female community of religious and educated women that she led, often attacking the other Thiassos or Thiasso. Her goal was educating young women for marriage with Aphrodite as the divinity and inspiration. Some say the early Christian church is to blame for the destruction of her works. Quite believable, I think, since one scholar called her a sex-crazed whore who sings of her own wantonness. But the way her works were received has become part of her important history. Yes, she was beloved by some, but others received her work awfully. She was lampooned by comedy writers and Ovid, and even modern writers changed the words in her poems so they're not misunderstood. We have 650 fragments of her works, with only 70 complete lines. At least we can read the historians telling us how great her work was, and that she was the greatest female artist in antiquity, I suppose. At least her legacy survives in parts, and reading more about her works is really interesting, and I would highly recommend looking into her a bit more. And lastly, we have day 3 with Sacagawea. It's day 3 of 31 days of Women's History for Women's History Month, and today we are talking about Sacagawea. Sacagawea grew up in the Shoshone tribe, but she was kidnapped by a Hidatsa raiding party, where she was later sold to a French-Canadian fur trader to become one of his many wives in 1804. In that same year, Lewis and Clark were travelling from the USA to map the uncharted West. She joined their expedition as she spoke the language of both the Shoshone and the Hidatsa tribes, so the surrounding people she could communicate with, which meant when Lewis and Clark were moving through, she could convince the people that they were there peacefully. She of course could also then guide them through the best routes to travel through the country, and she did all this as just a teenager with her brand new baby strapped on her back. Because of her help during the expedition, Lewis and Clark came to see her as an equal, which is very impressive for a woman of 1806. She was born in 1788 and is thought to have died in 1812, but as a very strong start, even that's debated. In Hidatsa, her name is pronounced with a hard G, so Sacagawea, which translates into bird woman, or if it's Sacagawea, it means boat launcher in Shoshone. But Lewis and Clark journals tend to support the Hidatsa version, which should suggest that that's how it's pronounced. But of course, the Hidatsas she was enslaved to would pronounce her name in their own way, so maybe she would still want her Shoshone Sacagawea. She was a Shoshone girl and was about 12 when a Hidatsa raiding party captured her near the Missouri rivers in about 1800. She was enslaved and taken to their village, where she was purchased by the French-Canadian fur trader Toussaint Charbonnier to become one of his many wives in 1804. I would try to pronounce his name correctly in the more French-Canadian sounding way, but he doesn't deserve it. They're living in a Hidatsa village when Meriwether Lewis and William Clark arrive and build Fort Mandan for the winter, and at the start of 1805 they hire her husband as an interpreter to accompany them to the Pacific Ocean. But obviously he's too thick to speak the language of the Shoshone people too, and it's decided that the pregnant Sacagawea would join the expedition party to help them communicate. In February she gave birth to a son, John Baptiste. They went off in April with her baby on her back, setting off to Missouri. In May, her husband nearly capsized the boat she was on, but she apparently remained calm and rescued all the important papers, books, instruments and medicines that they might need. And later, Lewis and Clark would name a tributary of Montana's river to her. She showed the native tribes that their party had peaceful intentions, she collected plants to eat and clothing, and she was a significant asset. In August, they encountered a group of the Shoshones led by Sacagawea's brother, who then helped to guide them across the Rocky Mountains, where they reached the Pacific Ocean, and she was allowed to visit the ocean to see a beached whale. It's said that her and Clark had become friends, and romance is an added modern twist that I think ruins it. I don't think she would have wanted romance then, and besides, her paid-for husband is still there. Afterwards, they return to the Hidatsa village and her husband receives money and land for his services to the expedition. But Clark wants to help more. He secures her husband an interpreter position in St. Louis, where they travel and baptise their son in 1809, before leaving him with Clark because he offered a good education for him. There's then the birth of a daughter shortly after, and a woman identified as Charbonnier's wife, presumed to be Sacagawea, died in 1812. Clark became the legal guardian of the two children and listed Sacagawea as deceased on a list in 1820. So perhaps she lived until then instead, and I'm inclined to believe that end of the story. Another theory is that she went to start another family, rejoined the Shoshones, and died in 1884. But these accounts are probably to do with a different Shoshone woman who had similar experiences. Although an expedition wouldn't be a common experience, so I'm not sure what those shared experiences would be. Let me know what you think, but I'm inclined to believe Clark because he recorded things a lot anyway. And that concludes week 1, or the first 3 days of Women's History Month. Thank you very much for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed. If you did and you're watching, please give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. And if you're listening, please follow the podcast and give it as many stars as you think it deserves. Hopefully 5. Thanks again. I'll see you soon. Bye bye.